The importance of asking questions, why they're at the heart of making good decisions. C-Suite Intelligence. Exclusive leadership lessons from coaches to the world's top performing executives. I'm Richard Davies.
Be curious. There's a lot to learn, and your job should be to learn and be curious.
Whoever you are, top-level manager, board member, up-and-coming middle manager, results are linked to asking smart questions in the right way. Taylor Griffin is Chief Operating Officer at the Miles Group. Speaking of curiosity, how do you think of good questions?
One, I like the idea of forcing yourself to ask questions to start with. So thinking of your job as being one to ask questions. So what I'll say is I'll call it the rule of 5. In interactions, force yourself to ask 5 questions. It's a really effective tool as a manager of people because you're going to learn a little bit more. It's a really effective tool as a direct report because you're going to get a lot more clarity. So forcing yourself to just ask questions becomes sort of the starting point. Once you start doing that, I think it becomes a lot more natural. I like to think of effective leaders as being highly Socratic. And so it's your job to be Socratic and just ask questions and be curious. There's a lot to learn, and your job should be to learn and be curious.
For those of us who are a little shaky on our Socrates, when you say be Socratic, what do you mean?
I mean, I ask a lot of questions. So the Socratic method is probably the most common form of this that you see in law school. And I'm biased because I went to law school, of course. But it's drawing people out through questions. And questions being, how you get at things. And I think you have to view your job as a leader like that. It's not statements, it's questions that you ask.
But it's not an interrogation.
No, it's not an interrogation. So how you ask the question, so it's a great point. How you ask the question really matters. Are you framing it in a way that's going to make the person's response be perceived well, or are you framing it and being sort of a jerk with it? That's not an effective question. An effective question is asked with the right framing in mind. And I do think when you're asking a lot of questions, it's okay to set context around that style. For instance, look, I want to learn here, and I'm here to learn, particularly if you're leading in an area where you're not an expert. I want to learn from you. My style is to ask a lot of questions, so I am going to be doing that on a pretty consistent basis. But, explain to me, this. And you can go into it with just a little bit of context up front to just sort of mitigate the impact that questions can have.
So don't just simply say, okay, what do you think about this?
Yeah, because I think when you go right into sort of that firing of questions, it's like a firing squad. It becomes very intense.
Are there questions that you really like that you've come back to and you've used in different contexts?
So this is going to sound overly simplistic, but I think the question why is probably the most powerful one that you can find. I mean, it's why is this so successful? Why is this not so? I mean, just think about it at its very basics. I think not enough people probe into areas that are performing well, and they don't ask any why questions around that, so they don't really get deep in terms of understanding what's going on, what may be key to success, but also maybe a potential risk in the future. And additionally, when things aren't performing well, just asking the why questions to get at it's the diagnosis of it. Or if somebody's underperforming, why are they underperforming? So instead of just saying they're underperforming, let's put them on a performance improvement plan, why don't we start with the why? It could be something going on at home. It could be something going on with their health. It could be 10 million things that have nothing to do with the person's capacity to do their job.
Are there less threatening ways of asking the same question?
Well, I do think it's around the softness and the language that you put around the question. It's around the tone of voice that you ask the question in. I mean, I think all of the softening comes with the context that you give the question as well as your tone.
I'm going to ask this question from 2 perspectives. One from you're the boss and you're in a meeting with lower ranking people. And the other also from people who are dealing with a boss, maybe a difficult boss.
Sure.
Are there times when questions are inappropriate?
Right. Just to start with the boss perspective and the boss operating downwards, I do think that you have to be cognizant of the situation. So, for instance, if you're asking a lot of questions of your direct report and they're surrounded by their direct reports, That isn't always the best set of circumstances. It can be, but you just have to monitor that. You want to make sure that you're not disempowering them in any way or making them look bad in any way. I think the other piece is if it crosses over into an area that would be considered too personal or a personal attack of any kind. Those are never appropriate. When you think about upwards, I think you do have to think about your tone and asking questions as well. This can't be around you sort of questioning your boss's judgment in a way that's disrespectful, that lacks appreciation for the hierarchy that does exist inside of an organization. So you want it to strike a respectful and professional tone always.
But is it okay for a direct report to ask a boss to explain their reasoning about something?
Yeah, I think so. I think you probably want to think about the context of the environment and the situation that you're in. If you're around your boss's boss as well, probably not the best time. So it really is sort of using some judgment and exercising some discretion in terms of how you choose and when you choose to ask that question.
And so that speaks to the importance of the one-on-one meeting.
Yeah.
Which can be really helpful, right?
I think it's a great opportunity for the employee to ask those types of questions, as well as for a manager to ask some more pointed questions where it's a one-on-one environment. You don't have the judgment of others around. You're not questioning decisions. It doesn't seem like you're reversing decisions by asking questions. There isn't others' perceptions of it that can create some negative ripple effects, I would say.
Can asking questions make your job more interesting?
Of course, because it's the element of learning.
That was a stupid question.
It's the element of learning. You would think that you'd want to ask questions and you'd want to dive into it because if you love your job, you're interested more broadly in terms of what you're doing, and there's always something to learn.
And maybe if you don't love your job, it's a way of loving it a little more.
Maybe so.
What can corporate culture do to encourage the asking of questions at all levels of the company?
I really think with corporate culture in particular, you sort of set the tone at the top. And so I think it's senior leaders role modeling this behavior, right? Role modeling it by they themselves asking a lot of questions and employees being able to see senior leadership asking questions. That could come in the form of, whether it's town halls, whether they see it sort of in terms of how they engage, whether they hear about it from their leader, that this is what our senior leaders do. And so they start to see their leader emulate those behaviors. It can come in a variety of forms, but I really do think culture starts to get defined by the tone the senior leaders set at the top.
There are questions and there are questions. I mean, sometimes there are questions that shouldn't be asked.
That's right. There are certain things that shouldn't be asked for various reasons of confidentiality. It's not something that should be gotten into with a specified audience. There's a multitude of reasons that you could imagine, not getting into specific questions or questions that make people personally uncomfortable. But if you stay clear of sort of those types of things, questions in and of themselves are a good thing. You see many more appropriate than inappropriate questions.
Should even top-level executives question themselves? And if so, what sort of questions should they ask themselves?
You hope that they do, right? I think it's really important. So, for instance, having that internal locus of control to question and doubt yourself, where you sort of check, is this the right path forward? Have I appropriately triangulated across the right number of people? Have I gotten input from a sufficient number of people? I don't think you want to see people question themselves in terms of their conviction wavering, because that can be really bad for an organization and create a lot of confusion. But you do want to make sure that they're sort of testing and validating their own assumptions and thinking.
Yeah. How does humility play into this? And what's the balance between humility and ego?
Well, there's healthy ego and then there's hubris, which is something different, which becomes arrogance. And I think arrogance doesn't play well in pretty much any company and culture in any environment. And humility does play well, but not to the point where you lack confidence and direction. Most organizations would say that they would really like their leaders to have the type of humility where they seek and take advice. That's really how I hear it defined most frequently, and where I see the most effective humility come out. It's humble enough to know I don't know everything, and so I should probably seek out advice and input from others who do know something on this topic.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because I assume that there are times when an executive doesn't know something that he or she maybe feels like they should.
Right.
And so it's difficult to reveal what you don't know.
Well, that's why I think asking questions versus knowing all the answers is the most important piece that you could have here as a leader. And that's the toolkit. A lot of people are put in these big, broad roles. They haven't done all elements of the role to be successful. And think of any internal transition to a CEO role. There's no way on earth that CEO has led in every function in every business area of that organization. So their powerful toolkit is asking questions where they don't know those answers. And it's using questions to find the answer and to get to the answer.
I asked you about what corporate culture can do to encourage questions. Mm-hmm. What about the board? What sort of questions should boards be asking beyond the obvious?
Well, I think for them, they understand it's their role to ask questions. I think the construct in general, provides that as the avenue for it. And their interface with management has to be around healthy questions and healthy tensioning of management. It can get a little toxic when the questioning feels like an attack and it puts management on the defense. So they do have to think about how they ask the questions, but their whole job is to ask questions. And so they're usually quite good at asking questions. It's just making sure that they ask it in the right way and that they play off each other in the right way so they don't pile on to one another, that one person can get a point across and another person can build on that point, but it's not about piling on against management.
That's a really important point you made, and it goes way beyond corporate boards, and that is asking or not asking questions that are perceived as an attack.
Yeah, I think you're always wanting to think about sort of who's the person that you're engaging with and how are these questions making them feel, and are you getting the best response for them? Because ultimately what you're trying to drive is a great outcome for the organization, and just getting somebody defensive or riled up isn't driving a great outcome. And so how you ask the questions becomes really important, and giving that person space and time to also respond to your questions.
Successful companies are nearly always top-down, mm-hmm. at least to a very large extent. So how do questions inform that?
Well, corporations have to be hierarchical. Hierarchy isn't bad. It provides clarity. When you're completely flat, sometimes it's not clear who's going to make a decision or if we're going to move forward on something. Questions are a way of seeking out information, of obtaining the right information so that the decisions made are well informed. And so I think it's just thinking through the lens of this is all about seeking out the right information to inform the best decision. And so receiving it in the right way is just as important as asking it in the right way.
C-Suite Intelligence is our free podcast. Executives from the Miles Group share what they know about management, leadership, change at the top of organizations, and so much more. Free podcasts are available on your favorite podcasting platform. I'm Richard Davies. Thanks for listening.